If you guys end up enjoying this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share to someone. It supports the channel a bunch. Thank you. Abel Tesfaye was born in Toronto on February 16, 1990, growing up in the Scarborough area. His parents, Mekonnen and Samra, were both Ethiopian immigrants, who eventually ended up separating, leading to Abel being raised primarily by his grandmother and his mother. Growing up in an Ethiopian household, he ended up learning Amharic, and also attended the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church. In relation to his father, Abel claims that there was no ill feelings towards the man, only having vague memories of seeing him as a kid. Fast forwarding to his teenage years, Abel described his experiences to being like the film Kids, but without the AIDS. Drug use played a large role, smoking weed from age 11, and only having that progress to things like ecstasy, Xanax, cocaine, and ketamine as he grew up. He even admitted that he used to frequently shoplift in order to get enough money for more drugs. He attended 2 separate schools in Ontario, but eventually ended up dropping out in 2007 and moved to the Parkdale area of Toronto. A couple years pass, and in August 2009, Abel decided to work on some music and eventually uploaded the song Do It onto YouTube, going under the name Abel Official. This was the first real sign where we could see that music was a true passion for Abel, continuing to follow up on this by meeting producer Jeremy Rose the following year, someone who talked to Abel about the idea of a dark contemporary R&B project. Rose had initially attempted to get artist Curtis Santiago to work on the project with him. However, after that didn't come to fruition, he decided to play one of the instrumentals to Abel, who in turn did a freestyle rap over it. With both of them being happy with the direction they were taking, they decided to collaborate on an album. Rose produced 3 songs, those being What You Need, Loft Music, and The Morning, but also several others which ended up being scrapped. In December 2010, Abel ended up releasing all 3 of these songs onto YouTube, under a name which comprised of only X's and O's. Despite his songs gaining rapid attention online, even being featured in a blog post from artist Drake, Abel's identity was still unknown. This didn't stop his music from growing, however, being picked up by media outlets like Pitchfork and the New York Times. Before finalizing himself as The Weeknd, he went under a couple other aliases, those being The Noise and Kane. Abel noted that during this initial period, he was still working at an American apparel store, with his unknown identity leading to his co-workers listening to his music without knowing that it was him. It was in 2011 where Abel ended up meeting music industry executives Sel Slaby and Amir Ismailian, which led to them founding their own record label, XO Records. On March 21st of that same year, Abel released his debut mixtape, House of Balloons, being released for free on his own website. The album included 9 songs, with an additional 10th track being added in a reissue of the album, with most of the tracks being produced by Elangelo and Don McKinney. The songs created by Jeremy Rose were also present on this album, however he didn't receive any production credits. House of Balloons is still considered to be one of the most influential and greatest R&B releases in recent years, with it receiving a huge amount of critical acclaim and attention. People were impressed by aspects like the mood and atmosphere of the album, with it tapping into elements of our subconscious at a completely unexpected time. Amazingly, Abel was still anonymous, however, with him performing one of his first concerts at the University of Toronto in April 2011. This then most likely went on to inspire him to go on an entire tour of Toronto, starting at the Mod Club Theatre. The performance lasted around 90 minutes, with Drake being in attendance for it. This led to both artists talking about collaborating after the show, leading to Abel being the opening act for Drake's shows scheduled at the Molson Canadian Amphitheatre. This collaboration between the 2 artists also translated to each other's music, with Abel helping out with 4 songs on Drake's Take Care album, and Drake appearing on Abel's second mixtape Thursday on the song The Zone. Talking of his second mixtape, Thursday was released on August 18th, 2011, containing similar themes to those that were featured in House of Balloons, such as Abel's drug use, experiences of love, and his newfound fame. He claimed that the title of the album was in reference to a contentious open relationship he shared with a former partner. This album was also praised highly, but perhaps less than House of Balloons, with outlets like Consequences of Sound writing, despite the ridiculously high highs on this album, it fails to maintain a great pace throughout. It struggles back and forth between good and great, whereas its foregoer grabbed great by the balls on the first track and never let go. After this album, Abel was still fairly shy, but was further coming out of his shell, still refraining from interviews, but choosing to communicate to fans through Twitter, which he attributed to his shyness and several insecurities. This is an aspect of his character that still pretty much holds true, with him eventually participating in interviews, but still being hesitant at the idea, and wanting to only do them when completely necessary. Only 4 months after the release of Thursday, Abel released 2 more projects, being Echoes of Silence and Noise EP. Echoes of Silence capped off the trilogy of mixtapes, being produced primarily by Elangelo once again. It released to favourable reviews like both his previous projects, with people praising it for Abel's dark persona on the album and disturbing wordplay, describing the music as druggy and claustrophobic. And secondly, the Noise EP, a project which consisted of 10 tracks, all of which were created before House of Balloons. Abel revealed on Twitter that a large part of why he released this project was because a bunch of songs were leaked by salty producers, but also because there were some genuinely good songs which he found after House of Balloons had released. Coming into 2012, the bulk of his time was spent on live performances, with Abel really coming out of his shell, starting an international tour in April, performing at huge events like Coachella. In September, he signed to Republic Records, eventually releasing a compilation album in December called Trilogy. This album featured all of the songs from his previous mixtapes, with them being remastered to a higher quality. It was also on this album that original collaborator Jeremy Rose finally got credit for his production on House of Balloons. Trilogy was a big success, charting at number 4 on the US Billboard 200, and obviously being praised for the same aspects that were previously lauded on the initial mixtapes. It wasn't until May 16th, 2013 that the title track to his debut studio album, Kissland, was released, with Abel announcing that the album would be released on September 10th. Despite its assumedly higher production value, upon its release, Kissland had a fairly mixed reaction from many critics. People still praised aspects like the production and Abel's vocal performances, however also noted that it wasn't dramatically different from his previous work, with not much innovation being present in his already established sound. It still was debatably his most personal project yet, drawing his fans even deeper into his mindset and how he sees the world. This debut studio album only boosted Abel's music even further into everyone's awareness, releasing at number 2 on the US Billboard 200. The following 2 years once again primarily included touring, with Abel performing his first headline tour with his King of the Fall tour. However, with him now being an established artist, he contributed music to huge blockbuster movies, such as The Hunger Games, Catching Fire, and 50 Shades of Grey. In this time, he also collaborated with artists like Sia and Ariana Grande, serving as a feature for the tracks Elastic Heart and Love Me Harder. It was in June 2015 at the annual BET Awards where Abel performed the 50 Shades of Grey single Earned It with Alicia Keys, but also debuted another new original song, The Hills. This was our first real taste of his upcoming album, with the single Can't Feel My Face being released that very same month. With these 3 initial songs, Abel managed to occupy all 3 slots of the Billboard Hot R&B Songs list, being the first artist in history to accomplish this. Around this same time, he also was revealed as one of the primary musical faces of Apple's new streaming service, Apple Music. In August 2015, he performed at the MTV Music Awards, eventually leading him to release his second studio album, Beauty Behind the Madness, coming out on August 28th, 2015. The album debuted at number 1 on the Billboard 200, reaching the top 10 in over 10 countries. It also had a fairly positive reaction when it came to critics, with outlets like Rolling Stone saying, "If the sound has widened and even brightened in spots, The Weeknd still rocks a serious Eeyore vibe for much of Beauty Behind the Madness." It did also come under some criticism for the same things that were seen in his last studio album, with some critics thinking that the overall innovation and creative advancements are less present than they were in his earlier work. Despite some of these critiques, it was easily his biggest project yet, being streamed all over the world and managing to gain accolades like Abel's first Grammy, which he won in the Urban Contemporary category. Beauty Behind the Madness ended up being the most streamed album of 2015, with over 60 million plays. Once again, after that album's release, Abel launched into another tour, this time being the Madness Fall Tour, his first tour to be at an extremely large scale, taking place across the entire United States. This took place over the course of a month, starting in November and ending in December. Abel also ended up collaborating with even more artists between this time and his next album, working with artists like Meek Mill, Travis Scott, and Future. Coming into 2016, he ended up being featured on Kanye West's The Life of Pablo on the song FML, with them collaborating for the second time, with the first being Kanye's assistance on the song Tell Your Friends from Beauty Behind the Madness. It wasn't until September of that year, however, that Abel would announce his next album, Starboy, saying that it will be released in November and will feature collaborations from the internationally known electronic duo Daft Punk. Abel claimed in an interview with V-Man that for this album there was a large influence from artists like Prince, The Smiths, and Talking Heads, and on November 25th, the album was eventually released. Upon its release, the album once again shot up to the #1 spot on the Billboard 200, with all 18 songs of the album managing to chart on the Hot 100, the second best simultaneous Hot 100 entry since Drake in that same year. The critical reception was once again fairly positive, praising Abel for his openness on the album and the confidence he exuberates throughout. Critics also praised how seamless and integrated the sound of the album is, praising its luxurious grooves and beautiful melodies. However, there were also similar criticisms that kept cropping up from his past two albums, those being revolved around a lack of evolution, with media outlet Pitchfork saying, "Starboy, by way of contrast to Trilogy, feels more like an opportunistic compilation of B-sides than an album. Who is The Weeknd? At this point, even the man behind the curtain might not know." After the album's release, we once again saw a 2-year period where Abel would help with other artists and feature on their tracks. He'd also promote his music on television, like his performance on Saturday Night Live in October 2016, and we also saw him release a short film titled Mania on November 23rd of that same year. Fast forward to 2018, and Abel manages to win another Grammy for Starboy, once again in the Best Urban Contemporary Album category. At the start of this same year, he also featured on the song Pray For Me in the Black Panther soundtrack, which was being curated by Kendrick Lamar. Not long after, on March 30th, we ended up getting a new EP called My Dear Melancholy. Fans at the time noted how the tone and musical direction of this album was much darker than his previous studio releases, going back to sounds that were more akin to his earlier work. The themes of this project revolved around heartbreak and anger, at times quite blatantly alluding to the highly publicized breakup between him and Selena Gomez. For fans of his work, this served as a way to get an even deeper understanding of Abel's mindset and connect with him as a person. However, critics looked at this album less favourably than his previous work, with this EP getting fairly mixed reviews. Despite there being some praise for some of the contemporary sounds that are included in the album, it did come under flack for trying to replicate past sounds at a time which was not deemed appropriate, with there not being a big enough gap between his old releases to feel like it's worthy to call back to. The outlet Spin also criticised the album's lyrics, calling them mopey and whiny, feeling like the album is self-involved and self-pitying with not much else to show for it, other than surface-level introspection. This, however, still didn't stop it from debuting at #1 on the Billboard 200. In this same year, Abel also released his compilation album, The Weeknd in Japan. This was mainly released to commemorate his first performances in Japan, being part of his Asia tour. After this, Abel once again went back to the studio to work on his next album, but still managed to stay in the public eye, working on songs like Power is Power, featuring SZA and Travis Scott in April 2019. But everything was fairly quiet until November 24th, 2019, when his new single, Blinding Lights, was announced through a Mercedes-Benz commercial on German TV. This eventually led to the single Heartless being released, debuting at number 32 on the Billboard Hot 100, and eventually becoming his fourth #1 single. This then led to Blinding Lights being officially released as a single, debuting at number 11. All of this build-up eventually culminated in the announcement of his next album titled After Hours, with the release date being marked for March 20th, 2020. When this time eventually rolled round, After Hours of course went straight to the top of the Billboard 200, breaking the record for the amount of global pre-ads on Apple Music, with over 1 million users pre-adding the album. Blinding Lights ended up shooting to the #1 spot of the Hot 100, with the album becoming the fourth best-selling album of 2020. After Hours also saw some of the highest praise out of any of his projects, with people praising it for elements like the narrative cohesion of the album and the natural evolution and reinvention that people were craving for in his past few projects. It was also claimed by outlets like The Independent that the album fused past and present elements of his work very well, saying After Hours still delves into a sad boy persona, but there's a tinge of remorse that runs through, in comparison to the cold and often cruel tone of earlier cuts. This album had probably the biggest controversy revolved around it as well, with the album's quality being undeniable, being a hit with both fans and critics. It was of course expected that it was going to at least receive some nominations from the most notable and prestigious music awards show, the Grammys. However, when the nominations were announced, there was not a single one for After Hours, shocking both fans and critics, but also Abel himself. In response to this, he took to social media, claiming that the Grammys were corrupt. And in a later interview with Billboard, he elaborated by saying he felt the snub was an attack. He said, quote, "Look, I personally don't care anymore. I have 3 Grammys which mean nothing to me now, obviously. It's not like, oh, I want the Grammy, it's just that this happened and I'm down to get in front of the fire, as long as it never happens again. I suck at giving speeches anyways, forget award shows." And that's basically where it ends for now. With his last few projects following a 2-year cycle, it's highly probable that we'll next see Abel release a new album in 2022. And perhaps if we're lucky, we'll get some singles by the end of this year. This isn't to say that he hasn't been active this year, releasing his second greatest hits compilation, The Highlights, and also headlining the Super Bowl halftime show, being the first Canadian solo artist to headline. Of course, with the COVID pandemic, it also meant that he wasn't able to go on his upcoming After Hours tour, which has been postponed to the start of 2022. He also released a deluxe edition of After Hours, which featured 3 bonus tracks, and recently released his first mixtape, House of Balloons, to streaming services for the first time. But other than that, and some features he's had with artists like Doja Cat and Belly, we're still waiting in anticipation for his next big project. Anyways, that was the video. If you guys enjoyed, make sure to like, subscribe with notifications on so you know whenever I upload, share the video to someone you know, and let me know your thoughts in the comments. Anyways, hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.